So welcome everyone to another episode of BetTalker, brought to you by BetBlocker. And today we got Adam Lyons. So welcome and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Pedro. I'm happy to be here.
For those that don't know you, could you be able to tell us a little bit about yourself, about your
Yeah,
background?
yeah, absolutely. My name's Adam Lyons, and I'm the host of the Modern Meeting podcast, which is a podcast that came to fruition after I entered recovery for a gambling addiction. To give you the short version of that, and then we can dive into it. I gambled from the age of 18 to 38. The first 10 years, it was kind of just figuring out life or, so I thought. Uh, started out in the poker boom, did a lot of poker playing in college, eventually started working for the casinos, which led to me, gambling and table games and kind of getting a little crazy with that. I ended up declaring bankruptcy in my late 20s. And then the final 10 years of those 20 years, I was kind of constantly looking for that fresh start. Um, I was ashamed of the bankruptcy and I pretty much left town. And those last 10 years, I had like 20 different jobs, worked in, I lived in 6 different major cities, had like 12 different addresses. I was all over the place. And, it wasn't until, wasn't necessarily a financial rock bottom, but I had one of those spiritual awakenings that you hear about. I was in the middle of Oklahoma. Don't ask me how I got there. We'll get there. But I was in the middle of Oklahoma in a parking lot after a 36-hour gambling binge, and I finally just had this moment wash over me, this feeling, and I said, you know what, I can't do this anymore. I can't. I never had the point. I never got to the point where I didn't want to live, but I didn't want to live this life anymore, and I made the decision to go to a meeting. 6 days later, February 8th, 2022. I went to my first GA meeting, and I haven't looked back since. And about a year and a half into my recovery, I'm looking around the rooms and I'm saying, where is everybody? Like, why am I the youngest person by 30 years? Why are there barely any women? There's no young people while gambling is exploding and expanding on the outside, right? And so I went to some of the GA veterans. I said, I'm thinking of starting this podcast. I want to bring this information that you guys have given me that saved my life. I want to bring it to the masses. Like, I know the whole anonymous thing, and we'll keep it anonymous, but like, this is some good shit that we're learning in these rooms. You know what I mean? Like, I want to get it out there. And they were like, can't do that. And they gave me all the GA jargon, and I said, okay. And so I waited a few months, and then after that, I said, you know what? Sorry, guys, I'm doing it. And I launched the podcast, and since then, it's been amazing. I launched it in November of 2024, and you know, I have met amazing people like yourself and Christina Cook. Shout out to Christina of Broke Girl Society. She's pretty much been, the driving force of not only the podcast but just me and my recovery. She's been amazing, and people like Sam DeMello of Evive. I now work for Evive, and so it's been quite the last 14, 15 months since I started the podcast, and we're just getting warmed up. We're just getting started. So yeah, it's been awesome.
Awesome. It's absolutely, an amazing story. And remember when I met you last year in the NCPG conference in Ohio, and I just went to the bar, and you were close to me. Say, "Hi, I'm Pedro." Okay, I'll get you a drink. We start talking. I start talking, and it's been it's you meet really nice people in conference and all of that, and everyone have a like their own story that is okay, there's some similarities, but they're all different.
Absolutely. And it's amazing too, like how small this community actually is. Where I mean, we're from all over the world, working in the addiction and recovery space. But I mean, it's like, I meet you and it's like, oh yeah, I know so and so. It's like, oh, I know so and so from so and so, and then you just kind of, and you know, I I definitely think that you know a lot of us have different ideas as far as what works, what doesn't, but at the end of the day, why I love working in this space and why there hasn't been a person that I haven't met that I didn't at least think that, like, you know what, like, they get it, they understand it, and like we're all looking for the same thing, right? Just to break this stigma, and to get people help, and just to it's time for people to realize that this thing, gambling, it's not going away. It's affecting way more people than you think, and it's okay if you admit you have a problem, and we're here to help, and I love the fact that there's a lot of us out there that are just waiting to help people. We just need the people to admit that they need help.
And it's this work of breaking the stigma. So look, this is something that, for good or bad, is there to stay. It's not going to
Yeah.
go away. And look, we cannot wait, until things get too bad, to start asking for help. Because this sort of thing. If you have a problem, if you have anxiety or depression, you reach out to your friends. Hey, I'm not feeling well.
Mm.
But if you're struggling with an addictive disorder like gambling, uh, you know, there's sometimes a bit more blocks.
Mm.
I wanted to ask you, could you tell me a little bit about, you know, your background? Where did you grow up? Your family, be like.
Yeah. So I grew up in a small town in Massachusetts, Clinton, Massachusetts, about an hour west of Boston. And I had a pretty standard, you know, late 80s, 90s, middle class upbringing. My parents both worked. I didn't really want for anything. But when I was 9 or 10 years old, I was first introduced to gambling from my uncle
Yep.
on my mother's side. My mother's side, there were some gamblers in there. When Foxwoods, which is a large casino in Connecticut, when that opened up in like 1992, I can remember, oh, Grandma and Grandpa at the casino, Grandma and Grandpa at the casino. Mom and Dad went to the casino with Grandma and Grandpa. Like everybody in New England was going to this casino. And my uncle Rick taught me how to play craps at 9 years old. And he did that by, we took the Monopoly board and we folded it up against the couch and we're throwing the dice. And he's telling me, how the hard ways work. And, seven, you don't want to get a seven once you establish the point. And I remember just loving it. Right. I remember just being completely infatuated with it. I tell this in my story. It's funny though, because I can remember when I lost in craps and I cried and I ran into the bathroom and I was throwing a fit. And I basically cried my way into my uncle giving me my dollar back. And I always say that, like, that was like my first bailout. And it was just like, talk about foreshadowing. It was just like, I have no problem playing and no problem like risking everything. But once I lose, it's like, it's not fair. It's not me pointing the finger at somebody else. Right. But so, growing up, I like to think that I was born with like this switch. And at 9 years old, that switch was turned on.
Mhm.
And but throughout high school, I played sports. I had a lot of friends. I had girlfriends. Like, I didn't have time to gamble. And there really, it was, late 90s, early 2000s. Like, there was really nothing to gamble on. It wasn't until I went to college, and this was like right around when the poker boom started. And, the movie Rounders, I remember we watched Rounders 100 times, and we started playing poker because, the thing for me was, I grew up in this small town, and I was kind of like the big fish in the small pond. And now I go to college and I'm going to this, it was UMass Amherst, which is like 20,000 students undergrad, which was more than my hometown. And I didn't adjust well. I was, just looking for something to be comfortable with, and that was poker. And so instead of going to the parties at college or trying to, go to class and do well, me and the 3 or 4 or 5 guys on my floor who all like poker, we just played poker 7 nights a week. And so it wasn't for a lot of money, but took up a lot of time. And that's where everything started started to become a problem because, it could be like, hey, Adam, you want to come to this party with all of us, or do you want to play one-on-one heads up for $5 on a Saturday night playing poker? And I chose poker every time. And but so basically, once after my sophomore year, I dropped out of school because I just wasn't ready, just didn't really didn't really enjoy it. And I ended up working at Foxwoods as a poker dealer.
Okay.
And you know, the the main part of my my the first part of my gambling was, and this is when I first realized, like, I didn't admit I had a problem at this point, but I remember being like, what am I doing? And so what I would do is, I was still living in Massachusetts, but I was driving 75 miles to work at Foxwoods. And they had this thing called the early out list, which was, you can sign a voluntary EO list, which means if they don't need you, they send you home. And so I would drive 75 miles. I would sign that list. And there were some nights where they'd be like, all right, Lyons, you're all set, bud. Have a good night. We don't need you. And so instead of driving home, I would drive 10 minutes down the road to the other casino and I would gamble all night. So I am supposed to be going to work and making money. I'm going to work, leaving work, and then losing money down the road. And that's when I had 3 different credit cards that I maxed out from cash advances. And that is when, I went from like playing poker, losing $5, $10 to now I'm in the casino. I'm playing craps. I'm playing roulette. I'm playing blackjack. I'm playing slot machines, and I can't get enough of it. And, and like I said, I maxed out 3 credit cards. A few years later, when I sat down with my dad, and I had like $30,000 worth of debt in like 2008, 2009. And my dad, who's great with money, he's like, I can't believe I'm saying this to my son, but I don't think you have any other choice but to declare bankruptcy. Like, you're never going to be able to pay this off. And obviously, if we only knew that that was the worst thing I could have done, right? That's the ultimate bailout. But we did it. And after that, once I declared bankruptcy, I didn't gamble for a few months because, I was embarrassed. I was ashamed. And then slowly but surely, the paychecks start coming back. And, I got the itch again,
Mhm.
and I went back out.
Uh, what happened when you declared bankruptcy?
Yeah. So basically, and I tell everybody who asks me, like, should I declare bankruptcy? I say absolutely not. But once you realize like the logistics of it, it's really hard to say no to it. I mean, for me, I had like 30 something thousand in debt. It was, the credit cards, a Best Buy card. I had my car that I stopped paying payments on. And it cost me like $3,000 to get a lawyer and do bankruptcy court. And then
Mhm.
that 30,000 is wiped clean. But for the next like 7 years, I couldn't qualify for anything. Never mind like a house or a car. Like, I couldn't even, if I walked into Target and tried to get a Target card, I'd get denied. So basically, your credit goes to zero and you can't do anything for 7 years. But at the time, I was 26, 27, and I'm just like, I'm not going to do anything for 7 years anyways. $3,000 to wipe away 30. Yes, please. And so that's what I did. But, you know, the reason that I tell people not to do it is because it's the easy way out, right? Like, I didn't get any of the pain, right? Like, it was just it was a bailout. It was 100% a bailout, like now I just, when I entered recovery 4 years ago, I was right around the same thing. I was about 30,000 in debt from not paying my taxes and, borrowing money from friends and family. And as of this past week, I'm debt free. And for the last 4 years, I paid all that money back, and there's just a big difference between digging yourself out of the hole rather than getting that bailout.
Something that that you said, before, that you were working at Fox Casino, and it was and I have worked for a lot of online gambling operators, and I have seen so many people that develop problems, and it's like, look, it's okay to look after your customers, but first you need to look after your staff.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I like to think that, I had a problem. I had a problem, out of the womb, honestly, like I said. Like it was in my blood. It was in my wiring. But working at Foxwoods absolutely like accelerated the process. Like I can remember, so when I did that dealer school, that was 8 weeks, unpaid, 4 nights a week. And and all we did was pretty much play poker with fake money, and everyone took a turn dealing, and that's how you kind of learned. And I loved it. I loved just shuffling the chips and playing the game. And you know, I was the best person in the class because like most of the people in the class had never picked up a deck of cards, right? Like I'd been playing cards since I was 10 years old. So like, I'm pitching the cards around the table like it's nothing, and I love it. And looking back, like, you know, I wasn't getting paid for it. It wasn't for money, but just the action, just being at the table, playing poker, talking to people. I loved it. And so yeah, I mean, once I started working there, and now, and this is, I don't really talk about this much on the podcast, but I have a front row seat every single night to a hand of poker every 2 minutes. So talk about seeds being planted, right? Like I'm sitting there dealing poker, and then I watch some guy win this giant pot of thousands of dollars. In my mind, in the back of my mind, that's like, ooh, that could be you. That could be you. That could be you. That could be you. And that happens all night. And then I get out of work and let's go. I want to go do that. And I would drive 10 minutes down the road, and I would try it. And Mohegan Sun down the road in Connecticut, they didn't even have a poker room. So, and at the time, I only played poker. I didn't, I did some scratch tickets and Keno, but I never really had ever played table games. But then once I played table games, that also destroyed my love for poker because, you sit down at a poker table, you're going to grind out a 3 or 4 hour session, and you might make a couple $100, where I could go to blackjack and I could win $200 in 5 minutes. So now, once you play table games, to go over to a poker table, yeah, it's not the same. You know what I mean? Like I don't have the patience anymore. Like I would rather just go play blackjack. I would just rather go play a slot.
Mhm. Uh, okay, but you come across like a really sociable guy, and I imagine, like, okay, you just enjoying, the company, having a chat, the whole social thing, and say, look, okay, I'm at university, I'm not going to the frat parties, all that, but I have my group of people. I mean, I don't know, how talkative there may be people, at the casino, but I suppose, you may have some, people with really interesting stories. You may be, okay, I'm working, but actually, it's like watching Netflix. I'm
Yeah,
listening to different stories, people that I know. They're
yeah,
happy to see me. Sometimes they win. And what you say. Like, oh, those are, a grand that I could have won.
hmm,
When they, I remember, also, when I had, staff, that they were talking, oh, this guy won this guy. But people,
yeah,
they focus sometimes on the winnings and say, look, somebody else is paying for this building, for this, for that. So not everyone is winning.
totally.
And the reality is that in the longer term, you can beat probability.
Yeah, no, for me, like, you know, uh, shout out to Billy Joel, one of my favorite artists. He has this song called Summer Highland Falls, and it's either sadness or euphoria. And that was my life for those 20 years, right? Like I was either up here or I was down here. There was nothing in the middle. And that went for when I gambled, it went for when I worked in the casinos. There were some, so as a dealer, you deal for 30 minutes and then you get tapped out and you go to the next table. There were some 30 minutes windows where I had the whole table in stitches and everybody's laughing and everyone's throwing me tips and, oh, Adam's great. And then there was others where if I had gambled the night before and lost everything, I'm just sitting there like this, just miserable, right? And people would say, Adam, what's the matter? I don't know, I'm good, And the same thing with gambling. Like if I was playing poker and I was winning, I'm talking to everybody. I'm tipping the cocktail waitress. I'm having a drink. I'm doing this. But if I'm losing, don't talk to me. And then at the craps table, forget it. Craps table, same thing. If I'm winning, I'm tipping the dealers. I'm tipping the shooter. I'm doing everything. But if I'm losing, not only am I quiet, but I'm mad at you. Like I'm angry. If you're the shooter and you throw a 7, I give you a look that could kill you, right?
Mm.
And for me, and I saw it as a dealer too. I can't tell you how many times as a poker dealer I had cards thrown at me. You know, like when someone folds, like, and they're throwing them at me. They're nicking my fingers. They're throwing them so hard, and all I attribute that to, both for me and for them. When you have, people don't like to use the word disease, but I use it as I had a disease. I have a disease. When you have a disease and you're in active addiction, for me, like there's so much like hate running through you, and there's so much just anger and resentment, like all of my character defects that made me an addict.
Mhm.
When you're in active addiction, those things are just running through you, and when you're losing, you're just looking to pick a fight. You're looking to blame somebody else, and it's scary. It's really, when I think about some of those nights, I had this thing I used to do, and I'm not proud of it, but I
Mhm.
think it just sums up what I'm talking about. If I'm at the craps table and I'm down to my last money, it's on the table, and I have maybe two or three $1 chips in the rail, and they throw a 7 and I'm out. I used to take the chips. I used to make eye contact with the dealers, and then I would throw the $3 in the trash rather
Mm.
than tip them and walk away. I mean, that's some sick shit. You know what I mean? Like that's some, I would walk out of the casino. I would spit on the floor. Sometimes I'd spit on the door as I walked out. I mean, when I tell that story now, people who know me over the last 4 years, they're like, I can't picture you doing that. And I'm like, I can't eat. I mean, it's almost like I was a different person. You know what I
Mm.
mean? And but man, when I for those 20 years, it wasn't all bad. I'm not going to sit here and say I didn't have some fun trips, or I didn't have some stretches where, like, whenever I was in like a good relationship, like I didn't gamble as much.
Mhm.
But I mean, the last 10 years, especially the last 5 years, I mean, it was dark, and it was intense.
When was the most difficult time? What was going on?
Great question. I would say, the reason that the last 10 years were the most difficult, and specifically the last 5, is because I was in complete isolation. I was living, so in those 10 years, just to give you the quick rundown. So I started in Mass. I moved to New York City. From New York City, I moved out to Vegas. From Vegas, I moved back to Boston. Boston, back to Vegas. Vegas to Washington, D.C., Washington, D.C. to Texas. So, with the exception of when I lived in Boston and New York, I was a plane ride away from friends and family. And, you know, once I left home, you know, I lost that built-in network of people that I could call and go hang out with, right? And so in New York, I loved it. I made a lot of friends, but after New York, I was alone, right? Like I had some coworkers that maybe I would go get a beer with or something, but for those last 5 years, with the exception of the year and a half I lived in Springfield, actually, not Boston, I was just alone. And so you take being alone, being away from everybody, and then the gambling, it's a recipe for just complete, just the lowest you can feel. Because and even it got to the point, Pedro, towards the end where I can remember being in Washington D.C. and I would drive up to Horseshoe, Baltimore, and I would hit a hand pay on a slot machine, and my face I wouldn't even crack a smile, because at that point in my mind, like I was down so much that I could hit the grand jackpot, which I did, and it doesn't even put a dent in it, right? And
Mhm.
so that last year or two, I think, to answer your question, like those were the lowest, because I knew that even if I won, not only would it not be enough, but I knew I was eventually giving it back. And I just couldn't stop. I could not stop. I can remember getting out of work at National Harbor, where I was the manager of the poker room. I had a staff of 170 people under me. Yet I was living that double life where I would get out of work and I would take off my suit, put on some sweatpants and a sweatshirt, and I would drive up and I would gamble until the sun came up, and then I'd go back home, sleep all day, and then go to work. I mean, there were stretches where I didn't see sunlight for days, you know, and yeah,
Uh,
it's a sick feeling.
did anyone, I don't know, like probably they recognize you, because you said that where you live at the beginning, you say, okay, there's two casinos, driving 10 minutes. Did anyone, okay, you may be struggling. Did anyone try to speak with you, help you, early
Yeah, so
days?
so you know, I thought that I was pretty open
Hmm.
about everything, especially post bankruptcy. Those last 10 years, I used to I used to use my addiction as a way to pull at people's heartstrings to try to get them to let me borrow money from them. So I would tell people like, "Hey, I did it again. I fucked up. I'm going to GA. Can I please? I just need $1,000 like to pay the rent," which was a lie. I was literally texting them that from the casino, right? But with the exception of my family, who constantly bailed me out, and the only reason they kept doing it is because I always paid them back. And I think, in the back of my mind, I'm like, listen, you have this safety net as long as you pay your dad back. So that's why I would always cross that line into like insane debt or borrow money from a loan shark or, you know, uh, write bounce checks. I would do all these things knowing that I could come to my dad with my head down. Dad, I messed up. He would give me the money, but now you got to pay him back. So when you do this again, you can do it again, right? But other than that, you know, gambling, it's one of those things where if I opened up to somebody, especially like when I was working in the casinos, if I opened up to someone and told them, they would like listen and tell me, yeah, maybe you should. But 90%, 99% of people, with the exception of my family that I talk to, they would all just be like, no, you're good. Like you just gotta budget, or you just don't bring your debit card. Or, it's almost like people were uncomfortable and they didn't want to, and I'm obviously not blaming anybody, but that's the difference between nowadays and before, where it's like, when I was going through it, there were no podcasts, there were no YouTube channels that talked about addiction and recovery from gambling. It was the Wild West. You know what I mean? And now I feel like the people that are out there that are struggling, like they do have the resources that I didn't have, which for me, as as a peer counselor and as someone who has a podcast about addiction, I get really frustrated when, people come to me and they say they want to stop, but for whatever reason, they're just not ready, and on one side of it, it's like, listen, guys, I was out there for 20 years. I understand that you're not ready, but if I had someone like me talking to me, telling me stories that is exactly what I was going through, that might have expedited the process for me, right? So, oh man, I don't know. I mean, it's 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 still to this day, it's something that unless you're talking to a professional or unless you're talking to someone who is in recovery, I think most people are just going to be like, hey, they take that stance of neutrality, whether it's like, hey, it's your journey, you'll figure it out. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't want to get involved. I have my own problems. And it's like, it's just a harsh truth, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I know that a lot of people they have their own problem, but I think this sort of thing of okay, everybody on the phones and all that, we have lost a bit. Like, okay, so let's go and have a drink and talk about it, or have a coffee, or it's a bit like people there really isolated. And also, when you mention, like, people in, working in the industry, sometimes I hear that people they're struggling, but they don't want, it's a bit like a double stigma. They don't want for anyone to know, because otherwise they think that it's going to affect their work, or oh, if I self exclude, then
Yeah.
everybody's going to know.
Right. No, and that's like the difference between between me and a lot of people is that I had no shame because once I got a loan from somebody because they felt bad for me because I told them I had an addiction, I was like, okay, that's another out. That's another way for me to manipulate somebody. And I just ran with it, right? But, when I look back and think about it, I can remember I went on a few dates with a girl, and we got to a point where I was like, this is like later. This is like 2018. This is like 3 or 4 years before I got help. And I can remember telling her, like, yeah, I struggle with gambling. Like, I'm trying to stop. And guess what? That was the last date we were ever on, right? Like, she ran for the hills. And so I think that definitely, like, was in the back of my mind too, those last 4 years, where it's like, well, you know, it was a combination of things. It's like, I now I'm afraid to tell people, but I know that if I get close to someone again, I'm gonna want to tell them, right? So then I just my solution to that was just not get close to anybody, you know.
You mentioned, a loan shark. It's a bit like, oh, that, do they threaten you? I don't know, like in the movies, to break your legs or to.
So what happened was, I got in deep with a bookie, and I owed a good amount of money, thousands, and no one ever in all my years, no one ever physically threatened me,
Mhm.
but definitely, get the text of like, hey, like, he needs his money, and that he needs his money is that text is coming like every 12 hours, right? And phone calls, and so I basically paid Peter to, whatever that is, Peter to pay Paul. Like, so I went to a loan shark from someone I was working with, who's like, hey, if you need that money, like, I know a guy who will loan it to you for 2 points a week or whatever it was. And so, like, I got the money from the loan shark to pay off the bookie, so the bookie's good, but now I owe this loan shark 2 points a week on top of the principal. And the 2 points, it was like, it ended up being like $400 a month just in interest. So after paying that for like a month, I went to my dad like I always did. And I'm like, Dad, here's the situation. And of course, my parents, to your point, are like, this guy's going to break your legs. He's kind of like, like, we got, and of course, that was one of the times where they basically disowned me. They gave me the money and said, we don't want you coming around here anymore until you get help, and this was like 2015. This was like 7 or 8 years before I got help. So, I started really putting my parents through hell like pretty early on, um, but, and, the one thing I will say too, I don't even know if there was a loan shark. I think not even my buddy, it was a guy I worked with. The guy that I worked with who physically gave me the money that he supposedly got from the loan shark, it was probably just him, right? And that's why too, like, there's a lot of times where, like, people who are down gambling, they'll just find all these bookies, try to make up the money to get even, and if they don't, they just ghost them and they just call their bluff, you know. And is anything going to happen to that person? Probably not. But guess what? Now that person is walking around looking over their shoulder that they screwed over 10 people. And that's the thing that I never took into consideration about my gambling is, you know, that's why it's so hard. It's the hidden addiction, right? Like, you can't tell if someone's an addict, like with gambling, because they're just walking around with all this pain on the inside, all this stress, all this, all this doubt. Like when I, for 2 years, didn't pay my taxes, I didn't know how much I owed. And so, you know, I was walking around not knowing, like, I mean, I would Google, like, hey, how long does it take to have to go to jail if you don't pay your taxes? Like, just walking around with all of that extra stress on top of just life's stresses in general. You know what I mean? But yeah.
Mhm. Uh, you mentioned that at some point you have an epiphany, like, okay,
Yes.
what happened?
Yeah. So this was amazing. This was a beautiful thing. So, I grew up Catholic. I was confirmed. But after my confirmation, I only set foot in a church for a wedding or a funeral. And as I got into my addiction, I kind of, I think at one point in my 30s, like I started identifying as an atheist, which, I mean, I don't even know if I was like, I only prayed to God when shit went sideways and I needed help, right? Like I was just one of those guys. And and then I just lost faith basically. And so I end up in Texas 6 months before I get help. And the reason I went to Texas, I said to my dad, listen, I'm about to get fired from National Harbor because I borrowed money from some of my employees and I paid them all back, but HR found out about it. It was a whole big thing. I was going to get let go. And so I quit before they can fire me. And I'm going down to Texas because they have these poker rooms down there. I knew a buddy who I worked with in Vegas who was opening the poker room, and I was going to make some great money. And here's the kicker, Dad. There's no casino within like 4.5 hours. So I know I have at this point, I'm like telling people close to me, like, I'm getting help. You just got to let me like get out of this financial hole. You got to let me get like a nice little kitty going, and then I'm going to go get help. So the plan was I moved to Texas. I was going to save $50,000, but I was going to send it to my father. Every night I dealt poker. If I made $500, I was sending my dad 400, keeping 100 for myself. And I did that for 6 months. And, I didn't send him as much as I probably could have, but I had sent him $10,000 or $15,000 at this point. But, I'm also, even though there's no casino, I'm sports betting. I'm playing poker, so I'm still, and I'm living in a hotel, which I actually loved. But so it's just one of those, I'm 37, 38 years old. I'm just living this like nomad gypsy gambler lifestyle. And so it was the NFC championship game, NFL, and I had a big bet on the game. It was January 30th, 2022, and I lost the bet. And we had been at a bar in Austin, me and my coworker, my buddy, and I was half drunk. And I did what I had not done for 6 months, and what I didn't think I would do. I hadn't set foot in a casino for 6 months. I lost the bet. I was half drunk. I got angry. I Googled the nearest casino, and I drove in the middle of the night, 4.5 hours to the nearest casino. And I then went on I didn't sleep for 30 hours, 36 hours, and I gambled. And I lost everything I could get my hands on. I borrowed from coworkers I had barely known. I was literally sitting at the slot machine, and I was texting anyone I knew, asking them for Venmos and PayPals, and giving every excuse, every trick. And about halfway through this 36-hour session, I said, this might be it. So let's go down swinging, right? Like let's go for it. And so after the 36 hours, I was sitting in a parking lot in the middle of Oklahoma. That's where the casino was that I drove to. And I'm just sitting there, and the sun's about to come up, and I'm just kind of looking around, and I had this feeling wash over me that I can't describe it, but I truly think that it was, for me, it was God being like, listen, are you good? Or have you had enough? And I just had enough. Like I was ready. For the first time in my life, I was just like, I can't do this anymore. Like I don't want to live this life anymore. The lying, the cheating, the stealing, the committing illegal acts to fund my gambling, the borrowing. It's like, look where you are. You're in the middle of fucking Oklahoma. You know what I mean? And so I call my dad, and I'm not going to lie. Like, I think part of the reason why this epiphany happened was because I knew I had to come clean to my dad, because I needed some of that money back that I had sent him to pay off all the people I borrowed from. But, 6 days later, I went to my first meeting, and I remember driving to that meeting. The same kid who I was having drinks with the night I went to the casino, he came with me as support. Shout out to Phil. to my first meeting. And I can remember driving there. And at this point, it's 6 days after the epiphany, and the disease is its last chance trying to convince me not to do it. Right. And so I'm driving there and I'm telling Phil, I'm like, I'm going to do this and I'm happy to try it, but like, I'm just depressed. Like, I just need to lose weight, or I just need a girlfriend. I just need a new job. I need to go back and work in restaurants. Like, I don't think it's the gambling, dude. I think like the gambling is a product of like, my depression. And I walked into that meeting February 8th, 2022 in Austin, Texas at 7:00. And I tell people this all the time. By 7:15, I had completed step 1 of the 12 steps. I had completely surrendered. I had completely realized that my life was unmanageable. These people, these beautiful people, when I walked into that room and they're all shaking my hand and making eye contact with me and, hey, congrats, welcome. I'm like, congrats. I'm a degenerate, right? Like, I'm in a Gamblers Anonymous meeting. Who the hell are you? Like, like we're all sick. And it's like, okay, yeah, we're all compulsive gamblers, but like, I'm looking at like normal looking people in this room, 20 amazing, beautiful people. I thought I was going to walk into what you see at, the bus station at 5 a.m. Right? No, like these are all just people that all also surrendered and got help. And, it was their welcoming energy and hearing their stories that were all just like mine and reading the literature of Gamblers Anonymous. It just hit me like a ton of bricks. And for the next 9 months, I could not go to a GA meeting without sobbing every time I shared. And, it was just life-changing, to say the least. It's the understatement of the century. But it all started with, I believe, God coming down, touch me on the shoulder, being like, all right, bro, like, are you good? Where do we go from here?
Uh, Tell me about the 12 steps.
Yeah.
Like you said on the first, what, for people that don't know, could you tell us a little bit about the 12 steps?
For sure. Yeah. So, I started going to GA meetings, like I said, February 8th, 2022. And I lasted about 3 weeks in Texas. And then, the people at the Texas GA were like, listen, you're still working in that poker room. It's great that you're not betting, but it's not sustainable. Like, you're going to have to, so I made the decision to move back up to the Northeast. Mm-hmm. And I lived with my parents for 90 days, and then I got my own place, and then I've been up here ever since. But so the 12 steps of GA, I mean, now I have to be honest, like I haven't actually completed all 12 steps. But I haven't completed them in the traditional way. I mean, on my podcast, The Modern Meeting, like I start every episode with a cold open, which is telling a 10-minute piece of my story in chronological order, which is basically step 4. So I've kind of bounced all around, but basically, from my understanding, the 12 steps is basically a blueprint. It's a roadmap for you to have some solid recovery, because, for a lot of people, they confuse being abstinent from a bet with recovery, right? Like, there's a big difference between white knuckling it and, not gambling versus being in recovery, not gambling, but also figuring out why you're gambling, right? Or just looking under the hood and really examining these character defects that you have, and examining, your past, and just trying to work through it and confront it. And, so like the first 3 steps is basically like doing like a moral inventory, right? It's handing over the fact that you're powerless. It's identifying a higher power. And for me, I mentioned when I went into that room in February 8th, I didn't believe in God, even though I knew something happened to me in that parking lot. I'm reading the literature, and that was the one thing that night that I was just like, ugh, everyone just kept talking about God, 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 God. And I told the guys at the end, I'm like, listen, I know I need a higher power, but I don't really believe in God right now. And they said, you know what? That's okay. It also says in the text, like, God, or, a God of your understanding. And very quickly, I made the fellowship my higher power, because to me, the fellowship, the people, it was unlike anything I've ever experienced. Like, especially like in 2022, when we're so just divisive and everybody's out for themselves. Like, I go to that meeting, and like the next day I have like 3 people calling me, checking in, asking how I'm doing. I mean, that is so powerful. Those were shots of medicine to my soul. You know what I mean? And like, so that was my higher power. And then, basically steps like 4 through 6, that is, making lists of everyone that you've wronged, and, identifying, your character defects, and then eventually letting go, right? Like identifying everything, making amends, and then letting go. And then, the later steps, it's about maintenance, right? It talks about, doing some form of meditation. It talks about, like the 12th step, which, what a lot of people do is like, steps, a lot of people who they go into GA and they love it and they're fired up and it's amazing, and they get a sponsor and they complete steps 1 through 3, and then they want to jump right to 12, because 12 is basically helping others and spreading the word of the 12 steps. And, when I first came to the realization I wanted to start the podcast, like a lot of the GA veterans were like, hey, easy, you're doing a little 1, 2, 12 there. You got to go through all the steps. And eventually I said, you know what? And this is about, this is honestly about what a lot of the modern meeting is about, and what a lot of, recovery philosophies in 2025 are about, is that there is no path, right? It doesn't, just because I go to GA, I can love GA for GA. I don't need to do the steps. Do I think the steps can help you? Absolutely. But for me, I have had zero urge to gamble, and I'm closing in, I'm 29 days away from 4 years. And, do I think someday I might do the 12 steps? Yeah, maybe. But guess what? I live my life a day at a time, right? Like, that's one thing that I've always taken from GA.
And
Go ahead.
it sounds, that this is a nice thing to do, like even if you don't uh, have an addiction, okay, to
Oh my
think about
God.
meditating, being in contact with people, let go of things, doesn't sound.
Yeah. Like this, if there's one thing that I take from GA, it's this thing on the front. I tattooed it on the back of my arm. It's the serenity prayer, right? God, give me the strength. Sorry, I'm on the podcast, so but God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Like, at the end of the day, especially early on in recovery, whenever I had those moments where I was just like, do I do this or do I do that? Serenity prayer, man. Like, can you control that? No. So you can't worry about it, right? Like, you can't stress about it. And that was a big part of my life. Forget about the actual act of gambling. I just always wanted to be in control, right? My ego would always take a shot anytime someone disagreed with me. And once I started just leaning into the serenity prayer and just worrying, making sure that my side of the street was clean, everything started falling into place. And yes, I Pedro, I can remember early on in recovery, I would be going home or going to holidays and listening to some of my family members or friends, and I just hear the way they talk or hear the way they judge people or hear the negativity coming out of their mouths. I'm just like, God, you would so benefit from a 12-step meeting, right? Like, it's just, just like, the new thing is that everybody should go to therapy. Like, if you can't afford therapy, go to a 12-step meeting. Seriously, and it's some of the greatest people I've ever met in my life.
I mean, I have been a therapist for a long time. Something is like, oh man, it's such a bad thing. That is not free, because it should be
Oh, I
something
know.
that everybody should have access to. It's
Totally.
something that is it's you know yeah, no, be like, okay, this is something that is not a luxury. It should be a right. If you're not feeling
Yes.
well, there should be someone there to listen to you and
And
to help you.
and that goes back to kind of, what I tell people is, like, when they say like, oh, you're in recovery, oh, like it's a bad thing. I'm like, recovery is a privilege. Like, I consider it a privilege that I have been given this information, and I've met these people, and I've been able to all that stuff that I was carrying around with me all those years, I've been able to let go and process it and learn from it and be happy. Like I don't regret anything because it brought me to this point.
Mm.
And I could not think like that 4 years ago, you know?
You know, it's also, that when you were telling me the serenity prayer, I was thinking, oh, it sounds, like really like a stoic thing. Okay, you deal with the things that you can and accept, you know,
Hmm.
to a certain extent, the things that you
Yeah.
can deal with.
Yeah. No, I mean, and that's, you know, it's, it's just when I think of the way that I lived my life, and the product of, I think it was the product of like the addictive behavior and the gambling. Like you could say to me like, "Oh, let's go out to eat." And instead of being like, "Sure, let's go," I would think, "All right, but where are we going to go? How are we going to pay for it? Like who, you know what I mean? Like I always went to the negative. I always went to the pessimistic. I always wanted to be like in control.
Mm.
And now it's like, hey, you want to go do this? Yeah, sure. Like, tell me about it. What's your plan? Like, what do you want to do? Right. And then if I decide I don't want to do that thing, that's okay. But like letting someone like hear them out, right? Like, I'm sure that's like not the best example, but like that's just, I went from being like selfish and judgmental and it was all about ego to now I'm selfless. I'm grateful. I am open minded. Like one of the best things in that yellow book for Gamblers Anonymous, about 4 days into my recovery, I reached out to someone in the Austin meeting and I said, "Hey, shout out to Leah. She's been on the podcast. I think she's episode 3. I said, Leah, of course, me being the compulsive gambler, I'm looking for the quick fix, right? I'm looking for the instant gratification. I said, Leah, what's the key? What do I need to do? And she's like, she laughs at me. She's like, yeah, no, there's no key, but I will tell you right now, look on page, I think it's page 13 or something. She says, you asked me how, right? How do you do it? Honesty, open-mindedness, willingness, HOW. She's like, anything about recovery is going to be rooted in those 3 things, right? Being honest, being open, and being willing. And that opened up this whole other side to my recovery where, forget about being honest with everyone in my life and coming clean and setting up payment plans. I needed to be honest with myself, right? And that's where I lacked for so many years in addiction, where I wasn't honest with myself. I just, the disease just peppered me with justifications and reasons. Why am I in Atlantic City at 3 a.m. in a gigantic suite by myself? If I really sat and was honest with myself, I could have possibly came to the conclusion it's because you have a problem. But instead, it was like, well, it's a Wednesday. You work in the restaurant industry. All your friends are working next day. So that's why no one wants to come with you. But hey, it's a free room. You're only down 3,000. You got 4,000 coming in next week, like, because you won those bets. Don't worry about it. And that was the vicious cycle for
Mm.
so many years.
What are your views about gambling now? That you're in the other side.
Yeah. So, I'm not anti-gambling at all. Um, I think that just like the fact that I can hang up with you right now and I can go have a drink or two,
Mhm.
I understand that people can go place a bet or two and people can go to Vegas and enjoy Vegas for Vegas. So I'm not anti-gambling. But I am anti, I just, I'm struggling with just the current landscape and how, you know, we went from a society where you couldn't talk about gambling and it was taboo and everybody was still gambling, right? To now it's on every street corner, it's on every TV, it's on every radio, it's on the internet, it's on every social media channel. And I go back and forth as to, like I said, in my opinion, everyone is born with that switch and it's either flipped on or it's flipped off or it's flickering. I do think that the current landscape is going to help turn that switch on. But I also think that, it goes back to the parenting. It goes back to, education. I do think that if young people have, the right role models, and they're being brought up the right way, and they're given some education, like I do think that, like, we can fight against a lot of the advertising and stuff. But once again, obviously not every kid has that. Not every kid has those parents to lean on. So, I think that I just wish that we could come to some sort of middle ground where we can say, yeah, we live in a capitalist society, and it is what it is. But like, the volume of ads and the AI algorithm, and the YouTubers that are just, the YouTubers are the worst. Those are the people that I just can't stand. The people that you know play with the house's money, or it's not actual gambling. I mean, those are the people that I think are really. But if we could just come to some middle ground and just kind of regulate the advertising a little bit, and like, I didn't realize this until recently. I'm pretty sure, like in Massachusetts, I think Encore, you can't do cash advances in Encore, which I think that's a great step in the right direction. Where if people have cash to gamble, go ahead. But if they're pulling out their credit cards like that, I don't think casinos should take credit to have people gamble, because that's where people lose their 401ks, and they lose their houses. You know what I mean? Like, so I really do think that eventually, like, I do think this is an epidemic coming. I think a storm is coming. But I think it's going to take a few more years. Like, I think right now there's a lot of people out there struggling, but they still have bullets left, right? Like, they still haven't emptied the 401k. The kids haven't emptied their trust fund. The kids haven't maxed out their parents' credit cards, but all that stuff is coming. I promise you, it's all coming. And then maybe then, and unfortunately, it's going to take more pain and more suffering. Maybe at that point, you know, people that are making these big decisions might take a look and say, okay, we have enough. Maybe we should cut back on
I mean,
X,
I'm
Y, and Z.
a radical moderate, and I think, like, look, we need to, and I have seen it in other countries. You see that, okay, there's a lot of advertising, then they come really strong regulations, and then,
Yeah.
the black market, and it's a bit like, okay, guys, just learn the lessons, say, okay, can we agree on, having, X amount of ads. And I think it's with everything, also with fast food, or look, we need to, if we don't self-regulate, then,
Yeah. I
we'll be
mean,
regulated.
I listen, I think that people are going to do what they're going to do. I mean, and once again, I did it for 20 years, right? Like, people ask me all the time, like, how much money did you lose? Not that it matters, but like, I don't even know, but it was probably like north of $500,000 over 20 years, easily, maybe more. I don't know. And, you could say anything to me, right? Like, you could talk to me till you're blue in the face. You could be someone close to me. Like, I can't tell you how many times my mom cried to my face, begging me to stop. And I lied to her face and told her I would stop. And then I went to the casino. So, once you cross that line into compulsive gambling, problem gambling, whatever you want to call it, there's really nothing that can stop you but you. That's, only you can come to that conclusion. But I think we can educate. I think we can prevent. I think the more of these interviews that happen, the more of these conversations that happen, and the more eyeballs that get on these, then the parent has the conversation with the kid. Then the college kid might pump the brakes on his latest parlay, maybe,
I was just thinking, on the movie Back to the Future. I was thinking, okay, if you can go back, with a DeLorean, what sort of thing do you think
88
you
miles
could
an
have?
hour, baby. Yeah.
Yeah. What sort of thing, like us, like not playing craps with your uncle, or
Yeah. I mean, I love this question, but I have to take the and it's really how I feel. I know it sounds like a cop out, but I wouldn't change anything. I really wouldn't, because it brought me here. It brought, like, I found my passion in life, which is talking about this, right? But just to play devil's advocate, I think the only way that all of this could have been prevented is if I got caught doing some of the illegal shit that I did. And it's some stuff that I can't even talk about, that I haven't talked about. But early on, there were a few moments where I did some illegal stuff to fund my gambling. And if I was caught and maybe went to jail, or, then eventually went into GA earlier, maybe that would have prevented something. But, and this is not something I talk about a lot. In 2009, Pedro, I went to a GA meeting with my buddy, and I kind of went as a joke. It was pre-bankruptcy. I was still living in Massachusetts. I was heavy into gambling at Foxwoods and Mohegan and playing Keno and scratch tickets. And me and my buddy went to this GA meeting. And once again, it was the same book that brought me to tears 13 years later, right? But I went into that meeting, read this book. It went in one ear and out the other. I shared my story because I'm a ham and I like to talk, right? But I shared my story up to that point. I heard some crazy stories of, school administrators who embezzled 300,000 and went to jail and all these stuff. But guess what? Me and my buddy left that meeting and we went to a bar and we played Keno. Okay. So, but I will say this. When I tell that to someone, they're like, well, I mean, how do you explain that? 3 words. I wasn't ready at all. Like, my brain didn't process that information the way it did 12 years later, when I had gone through 12 years more of shit to be able to process it.
Okay, this is really, interesting, because sometimes, you know you get expert by experience, talking about the stories. Sometimes, it can be a little bit glamorized, and all this. The hard stuff maybe is not that there. Okay, I went to jail. Okay, I got beaten up, or or get shined. Sometimes it's all very okay. I don't know, embezzled this amount of money. Playing poker, this, but then I didn't go to jail because I sort of, you know, was sorry, and they took pity of me. And they tell that story, and sometimes I'm a bit worried. This will be like, okay, people say, yeah, it was fine, but that's not going to happen to me. I think sometimes the more normal, everyday guy story, can be more impactful.
Absolutely. And once again, I think, if I had a podcast to listen to in 2015 or 2016, or if I had heard someone tell a story of overdrafting their checking account like I did so many times, that might have sent something into my brain, like, oh, wow. Like that feeling of not being alone, right? That feeling of connection. But I never got it. All I got was bad beat stories and war stories and other gamblers telling me, oh, I hit 7 out of 8 on this parlay, or, I got sucked out on the river in this poker tournament where I would have won. And then I'm like, oh, here's my story. That's all I heard, right? There was nobody who had any recovery in them. It was just all a bunch of sick people telling their sob stories.
I promise you, this is the last question.
I could go all day, Pedro. Whatever you want, bud.
Tell us a little bit about your work at Evive.
Yeah, Evive. Yeah. So this is actually a fun story. So, I start the podcast. The podcast is going good. I have Christina on the Modern Meeting, and at the end of the interview, she tells me off camera, she's like, I got to introduce you to Sam DeMello. He has this app called Evive. I think you guys would really vibe. Modern Meetings mission. She's like, it sounds very similar to Sam. Like, as far as just, meeting people where they are, and it's not just GA. It's not just, it could be anything. Recovery can be anything, right? Like, and we want to tell stories. We want to help people. And so I meet Sam, I have him on the podcast, and, the running joke for like the next 7 or 8 months when Sam and I would ever connect was like, he would tell me like, listen, Evive is a startup at this point, but like, I'm hiring you at some point. So be ready. And at this point, I'm just like, that's what I want. Like, I had worked in restaurants. I'd worked in hospitality my whole life, whether it was restaurants or casinos. And then recently I worked in sales. But so I was working in sales at the time, and, he told me, he's like, listen, be ready. And I'm like, I'm ready. And about, this was like, November, I think I woke up to an email from Sam. He's like, are you ready? I'm like, I'm ready. And so basically I'm the customer success manager at Evive. And basically, my job is outreach, and I am, because, the beauty of Evive is that it's funded by the states. So anyone in the country, and hopefully eventually the world, who wants to use Evive, it doesn't cost them anything. So I need to go around, and I am reaching out to, colleges and universities, compliance offices, athletic departments. I'm reaching out to, church groups, clinicians' offices, peer counseling, treatment centers. And I'm just trying to get all of these people to introduce their clients and their students to Evive. And basically, to give you the quick pitch of Evive, it's a digital app that meets you wherever you are in your gambling journey, whether you want to stop gambling completely, or you want to manage your gambling, or you're just curious, And so once you get into the app, there's a daily check-in. You can track your wins and losses. You can track your mood. You can, and then there's all kinds of educational resources. There's all kinds, like, I'm telling you right now, if there's one thing, if Evive, and I'm not just saying this because I work there, if Evive existed when I was still out there, this might have expedited the process, right? Because if I started logging my wins and losses truly, and started logging how I felt after every loss, and then I go back and look at that data, I'd be like, shit, like, I need some help. But so yeah, it's just been amazing to be able to work alongside Christina and Sam, and we're starting, like, I need more stuff to do, but we're starting a podcast called Evive Live, which actually premieres next week, where it's me and Christina, and you're actually on our list, Pedro. So we're going to be calling you eventually to be a guest. But yeah, so we're leaning more into like the talking to the experts and affected loved ones, and we're sprinkling in some lived experience people, but we really want to dive into like the science behind gambling addiction, and just the different treatment, and just where the industry is headed. So that's going to be pretty exciting. But yeah, it's like I said at the top, it's been an amazing 14-15 months, and and I got a lot more things I'm looking to accomplish.
Awesome. So we're going to wrap up now. I'm taking a bit too much of your time. Where people can find you if they say,
yes,
I love Adam, I want to listen to him a bit more.
Absolutely. So the Modern Meeting, the podcast, is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, pretty much all major podcast platforms. Would love if you guys could subscribe to the YouTube channel. You see Pedro on there. He looks like $1 million. The YouTube channel is just at Modern Meeting. We're also on TikTok. And then, another thing is we started a Zoom meeting. So basically a weekly, it's not a GA meeting. It is a meeting for anyone, whether you're in recovery or curious about recovery or an affected loved one. It's Monday, 8 p.m. Eastern on Zoom. And I just ask that you email me modernmeetingpod@gmail.com, and that's where I can give you all the information for the Zoom meeting.
Awesome. So thank you very much. And
Pedro, this was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.